Spring 1907. A river valley in the American Midwest swells past its banks after 11 days of rain. The water doesn't just flood the fields, it eats them. Whole acres of topsoil slide into the current, peeling back decades of earth like a lid coming off a box. When the water finally pulls back, a farmhand named Elias Ward is the first one out to check the damage. He expects mud. He expects fence posts and drowned cattle. He does not expect a row of stone lids, each one taller than a man, sitting exposed in a trench the flood carved out of the hillside. He counts 7 of them before he stops counting. The coffins, if that's even the right word, are nearly 9 feet long, too long for any casket he's ever helped carry, too heavy for 2 men to shift, let alone 1. Word spreads through the township before the mud even dries. By the next morning, there are 20 people standing at the edge of that trench, and every single one of them is asking the same question: who builds a coffin for someone 9 feet tall? The county sends a clerk to log the incident. He writes 4 lines: flood damage, unusual stone formations exposed near the Ward property, recommend further review by state geologist, case closed pending inspection. That inspection never happens, not that spring, not that year. And here's the part that should bother you. The stone lids are photographed. At least 3 witnesses describe a man with a box camera on a tripod out at the site for the better part of a day. Those photographs are logged as received by the county recorder's office. They are not in that office today. They were never transferred to the state archive. They do not appear in any newspaper morgue, any historical society file, any private collection anyone has been able to locate in over a century of looking. A whole day of documentation gone. What we're left with is this: a written account from a county clerk who saw the site with his own eyes and never filed the follow-up report he was ordered to file. A farmhand's family who kept the story alive in 4 generations, in a version that gets a little more careful, a little more hedged every time it's retold. And an empty trench, backfilled sometime before 1911, that today sits under a soybean field with no marker, no plaque, and no mention in the county's official history. Somebody decided this didn't happen, and they were thorough about it.
To understand why this story survived at all, you have to understand Elias Ward. He wasn't a storyteller. He wasn't the type of man who exaggerated for attention. Neighbors described him as quiet, reliable, the kind of man you'd trust to keep your books straight. He farmed the same 80 acres his father cleared, and he stayed on that land until he died. Which is exactly why what he did next matters. Ward didn't just tell people about the coffins, he measured them. In a leather ledger he used for tracking feed costs and livestock, he recorded the dimensions of all 7 stone lids, the depth of the trench, the distance between each one, and a rough sketch of how they were arranged, not in a haphazard line, but in a deliberate pattern, spaced with what looks like intention. That ledger survived. It's the one piece of primary evidence from 1907 that anyone can still hold in their hands. And it tells you something the missing photographs can't. Ward wrote that the lids weren't just oversized, they were carved, smoothed on the exposed face, with faint tool marks along the edge that he compared, in his own words, to cut stone, not river stone. He was drawing a distinction between something shaped by weather and something shaped by hands. 9 days after the flood, a man arrives from the state capitol. Ward's ledger doesn't name him, only describes him as the surveyor, here on behalf of the state geological office. He asks Ward for a tour of the site. He takes his own measurements. He asks Ward not to let anyone else near the trench until his office issues a formal statement. The formal statement never comes. What comes instead, 6 weeks later, is a work crew, not from the state, but hired locally, with instructions to backfill the trench for public safety. Ward isn't consulted. It's his land, and he isn't consulted. He writes one more line in the ledger that autumn, just this: "They filled it before anyone official ever saw it filed right. Makes no sense unless someone wanted it filed wrong." That's a farmer, in his own book, in his own words, describing what sounds like a cover-up before that word even existed the way we use it today.
Ward's ledger would be an interesting footnote on its own. What makes this case different is that his story is not the only one. In 1931, a retired school teacher named Constance Hobbs gave an interview to a small regional history society, a recording that survives today only because the society's tape collection was digitized decades later, almost by accident. Hobbs claimed her father worked on that 1907 backfill crew, and according to her, the men doing the work weren't just told to cover the trench, they were told to remove the stone lids first and haul them somewhere off the property entirely. She describes her father coming home that week unusually quiet. When she finally asked him what was wrong, he told her something she never forgot. He said the lids were too heavy to lift by hand, so the crew used a block and tackle rig normally reserved for moving grain silos. And when the last lid came free, he said there was something underneath that made every man on that crew stop talking to each other for the rest of the day. Hobbs' father never told her what it was. He told her some things aren't meant to be repeated, only remembered. He died in 1946, and whatever he saw in that trench died with him. That alone would be second-hand testimony, easy to dismiss. But 6 years after Hobbs gave that interview, a construction crew 22 miles away, digging foundations for a grain elevator, struck what their own supervisor logged as large stone slabs, dimensions consistent with reported 1907 find. That's the exact phrasing in a surviving work order from that project. Someone on that crew, or someone supervising it, already knew about Ward's case, already had a name for it, the reported 1907 find. Which means this wasn't an isolated flood accident that one farmer stumbled onto. This was already, by 1937, something with a reputation, something crews were briefed on, something with an expected shape, an expected size, an expected response. Bury it, move it, don't file it right. And the grain elevator slabs? Also removed, also never inventoried, also missing from any public record today. One incident is strange. 2 incidents, 30 years and 22 miles apart, following the same pattern of discovery and disappearance. That's not strange anymore. That's a procedure. Once you start looking for the pattern, you start finding it in places you didn't expect. Between 1890 and 1940, county and township records across a surprisingly wide stretch of the Midwest and Upper South show a strange cluster of similar entries, brief, vague, and almost always followed by silence. Unusual skeletal remains reported, oversized. Stone formation of uncertain origin, site secured pending review. Excavation halted, remains reburied at landowner's request. That last phrase should catch your attention. Reburied at landowner's request. Over and over across different counties, different decades, different clerks, the same bureaucratic phrase, functioning almost like a stamp. A polite, official-sounding way of saying, this is now closed and no one needs to ask why. Historians who study this era will tell you record-keeping in rural counties was inconsistent, and that's true. But inconsistency doesn't explain a repeated phrase. Inconsistency explains missing records. It doesn't explain matching cover language.
There's a name that surfaces more than once in the margins of these cases, never as an official title, always as a rumor passed between local historians, a traveling federal or state-affiliated inspector, sometimes called the surveyor, sometimes the company man, who appears at these sites in the days immediately following discovery and whose visit reliably precedes the record going cold. Nobody has ever definitively identified who this was, or whether it was even the same person across every case, or an informal role passed between different officials who used the same playbook. What's consistent is the outcome. Site visited, formal report promised, formal report never filed, site cleared. Now think back to Ward's ledger, the surveyor, the exact term he used in 1907, decades before anyone else's account surfaces using the same word for the same kind of visitor. That's not a coincidence you can talk yourself out of. That's a role, a function. Somebody's job, quietly repeated across a region and a half-century, was making these discoveries disappear from the record. Not the ground, necessarily, just the paperwork. The stone lids didn't need to vanish into thin air, they just needed to stop existing on paper. Which raises the only question that matters now. If this was happening systematically, who was it protecting? The dead in that trench, or something about the living world that a 9-foot coffin, cut by hand, threatens to unravel?
Here's where the case stops being local and starts being something bigger. If Ward's measurements are accurate and his ledger is precise, almost to the point of obsession, the individuals buried under that hillside were not simply tall, they were built on a completely different scale, one that doesn't match any documented human population from any period of recorded American history in that region. That alone is enough to explain why an official record might get quietly buried instead of publicly confirmed. An honest report, filed properly, would have forced institutions to answer a question they may not have had an answer for. Not who were these people, but what were these people, and does their existence rewrite something we've built our entire historical timeline on? But it's the pattern, the repetition across decades, the shared language, the recurring figure of the surveyor that turns this from one strange local flood story into something closer to a policy, a quiet, unofficial, but remarkably consistent policy of managing discoveries like this one before the public ever gets a clear look at them. Think about what that means. It means this wasn't a single cover-up by a single embarrassed county clerk. It means somewhere, at some level, someone understood these discoveries were going to keep happening and had already decided, long before Ward's flood, exactly how to handle it when they did. That's not panic, that's preparation. And if there was preparation, there was knowledge, which means somewhere, in an archive we haven't found, a file we haven't been shown, a name we haven't connected, there's a record of exactly how many times this happened, and exactly what was found, and exactly why it needed to stay buried on paper as thoroughly as it was buried in the ground. Elias Ward's ledger survived by accident. It sat in a barn, in a box, forgotten by everyone except his family for over a century. That's the only reason we're talking about this case at all. Which means the far more unsettling question isn't what was under that hillside in 1907. It's how many other ledgers like his never made it out of the barn.
Somewhere, right now, there's a soybean field sitting quietly over a backfilled trench, and nobody working that land has any idea what's underneath it. The county record still says 4 lines: flood damage, unusual stone formations, recommend further review. Review never happened. Constance Hobbs is gone. Her father is gone. Whatever he saw in that trench before the crew went silent for the rest of the day, that answer went into the ground with him, and it is not coming back. What's left is a pattern, a phrase repeated in county records 100 miles apart. A man called the surveyor who shows up right before the paperwork stops. A ledger that never should have survived, sitting as the only hard evidence of something that officially never happened at all. If you're the kind of person who stops scrolling when a story doesn't add up, if something in you already knew before I said it that this wasn't really about one flood in one county in 1907, then you already understand why this channel exists. We don't chase the story everyone already knows. We go looking for the 4 lines nobody followed on, the ledger nobody was supposed to keep, the trench that got filled in a little too fast, on a crew that didn't ask questions, on the word of a man whose title nobody can confirm. Somewhere there's another Elias Ward, another ledger in another barn, another field with something under it that was never supposed to surface again. If you find it before we do, you know where to send it.